The night Porter Wyndham found the note, he was already running late for a board meeting he didn't care about. It was tucked under the wiper blade of his Audi, a folded piece of paper torn from what looked like a grocery receipt, the handwriting small and careful on the blank side. Your left rear tire is going flat. You might want to check before the highway. The woman in the green coat. He stood in the parkade under BCE Place and stared at it for a moment. Then he looked at the tire. She was right. He didn't know why he kept the note. 3 weeks earlier, Porter Wyndham had turned 42 in a boardroom in downtown Toronto, surrounded by people who worked for him and nobody who knew him. His assistant Bridget had ordered a cake, chocolate, 3 layers, the kind you'd get for a retirement party, and everyone sang with that particular stiffness of people who aren't sure if the boss wants them to sing or not. Porter smiled the way he'd learned to smile at those things, correctly, without anything behind it. He drove home that night to a condo on King West that cost more per square foot than most people made in a month, poured 2 fingers of scotch he didn't finish, and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the lake. He was the CEO of Wyndham Infrastructure Group, a company his grandfather had started with 2 trucks and a contract to repave a stretch of the Trans-Canada. Porter had spent 20 years turning it into something his grandfather probably wouldn't recognize. 3,000 employees, projects from Vancouver to Halifax, a portfolio that included bridges and transit systems and water treatment facilities. He was, by every measure that people used to measure such things, a success. He didn't feel like. He felt like a man standing at a window in the dark, finishing a drink he didn't want, in an apartment that still had moving boxes in the 2nd bedroom after 14 months. His marriage had ended quietly, the way most things in his life ended. Without drama, without a real conversation, just a slow withdrawal of warmth until one morning, Diane packed 2 bags and said she couldn't keep pretending they were building something together when she'd felt alone for years. He hadn't argued. He wasn't sure she was wrong. That was 18 months ago. He went to bed at 11:15 and set an alarm he didn't need. In the morning he would go back to the office. That was what he did. The first time he saw her properly was a Tuesday morning in February, outside the Tim Hortons on Front Street. He'd been walking to a breakfast meeting, head down against the wind off the lake, when he heard a kid crying. Not the ordinary kind of crying, but the particular escalating sound of a child who has reached the end of every available resource. He looked up and saw a woman crouched on the sidewalk in front of a small boy, maybe 4 years old, holding a paper bag in one hand and a coffee in the other while she talked to him in a low, even voice. She was wearing a green wool coat. "I know," she was saying. "I know it's cold, and I know you're tired, and I know you wanted the other muffin. We'll get the other muffin tomorrow, okay? Today we have blueberry. Blueberry is good." The boy said something Porter couldn't hear. "Because that's what they had," she said. "And blueberry is, yeah, it's got the little pieces in it, like purple polka dots. Do you want to see the polka dots when we get inside?" The boy thought about this. He sniffled. "Polka dots," she said very seriously. "I promise." He followed her inside without meaning to. She stood in line ahead of him, the boy now balanced on her hip, his face pressed into her shoulder while she scrolled through her phone with one thumb and reread something twice with the slight stillness of a person calculating. She ordered a small coffee and a breakfast sandwich, and when the kid reached out and grabbed the edge of the display case, she caught his hand without looking. Porter ordered his coffee and left. He was 2 blocks away before he realized he'd watched the whole thing like it was something he'd been missing, some ordinary human frequency he'd forgotten how to pick up. He was late to his meeting. He saw her again in the parkade, and then at the coffee shop, and then, on a Friday evening when a late March cold snap had dropped the temperature back below 0, he saw her changing a flat tire in the rain. She was in a parking lot off Wellington, under a half-functioning overhead light, and she clearly knew what she was doing. Jack already positioned, lug nuts loosening, but she was also soaking wet, her green coat dark with rain, and the spare she'd pulled from the trunk was smaller than the others. A donut. She was going to have to drive carefully. Porter had pulled in to pick up dinner. He sat in his car for a moment, watching. He got out. "Do you need help?" She looked up. She had dark hair, wet and escaping from a ponytail, and the kind of face that was more interesting than conventionally pretty. High cheekbones, a small scar near her left eyebrow, eyes that registered him with neither surprise nor particular warmth. She was assessing whether he was useful or a complication. "I've got it," she said. "I can see that." He stayed where he was. "But it's raining." It is, she agreed, and turned back to the tire. He stood there feeling faintly ridiculous. I'm Porter Wyndham. She didn't look up. I know who you are. Your company built the lakeshore overpass. There were some complaints about the drainage. He blinked. There were. We fixed them. I know. I covered it. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. Joanna Vick, I'm with the Examiner. He should have left. A journalist in the rain with a flat tire was exactly the kind of situation that became an anecdote in someone else's story. But she was already standing, brushing wet grit from her knees, and something about the way she moved, efficient, unbothered, entirely self-contained, kept him there. The drainage issue was a subcontractor problem, he said. We took responsibility anyway. I reported that. She picked up the flat tire. You want to make yourself useful. You can put this in the trunk. He put the tire in the trunk. She didn't thank him immediately, which he respected. She closed the trunk, peeled off a wet glove, and held out her hand. Thank you, Mr. Wyndham. Porter. Joanna. She looked at him for a moment with that same assessing quality. Your office has been declining comment on the Portland's project for 3 weeks. It has. Is that going to change? Probably not this week. She nodded as if this were the answer she expected. Drive safe, she said, and got in her car. He stood in the rain for a second after she'd pulled out. Then he went inside and got his dinner, and drove home, and thought about the Portland's project, and about the way she'd said I covered it. Matter of fact. Like accountability was just a thing you did. He thought about her the whole drive home. He wasn't sure why that felt important. The note under the wiper blade was the third time he found one. The first had been 2 weeks after the parking lot slid under his office door. Portland's comment. I'm still asking. JV. Professional. Borderline aggressive. He'd read it twice and then asked Bridget to schedule a call. The second was left at the front desk with his name on it. The morning after a city infrastructure meeting he hadn't expected her to be at. You said, stakeholder alignment, 11 times in 40 minutes. That might be a record. JV. He'd laughed alone in his office for the first time in longer than he could remember. The tire note was different. It was just concern. Just a small act of paying attention. You might want to check before the highway, with no angle, no story, no agenda. He kept it in his jacket pocket, which was not something he examined too closely. He called the number at the bottom of her cards. She answered on the second ring. Your sources for the Portland's piece are incomplete, he said without preamble. Hello to you too. A pause. How incomplete? Significantly. You're missing the environmental assessment findings from November, and the reason we've been quiet isn't obstruction. It's that we're waiting on a provincial ruling that changes the whole picture. Silence. He could hear her thinking. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because the story you're going to write with the information you have is going to be wrong, and I'd rather be on record with the actual facts. Another pause. That's unusually reasonable for a CEO. I have my moments. She laughed, short and surprised. It was a good laugh, unself-conscious, like she hadn't meant to let it out. They talked for an hour and 20 minutes about the Portland's project. It was the best conversation he'd had in months. Joanna Vick was 38 years old and had been at the Examiner for 11 years. She'd spent 6 of those years covering city infrastructure and municipal politics, a beat that most people considered the least glamorous in journalism, which she considered a feature rather than a bug. It meant the people she called were always a little surprised she'd done the reading. Her son Emmett was 4. He liked dinosaurs and blueberry muffins and a specific stuffed rabbit named Gerald. His father had left when Emmett was 8 months old, a fact Joanna mentioned once, very briefly, without bitterness, in a way that told Porter it had been processed thoroughly and filed. She lived in Leslieville in a narrow Victorian semi that she'd bought with her mother's help. And she made coffee on a stovetop mocha pot, and she ran 3 mornings a week along the waterfront before Emmett woke up, and she had a scar near her left eyebrow from a car accident at 24 that she did not remember getting because she'd been unconscious. He learned these things slowly, over calls that started as background for her stories and became other things. Over coffee twice, once at a place she chose near her office, once at a place he chose near his, and she was the same in both locations, which said something, though he couldn't have said exactly what. He did not tell anyone he was talking to Joanna Vick. He didn't know what he would have said. There's a journalist I like felt insufficient. I think I might be falling for someone felt like a sentence in a language he'd forgotten he spoke. His so-o, Hartwell, noticed he was smiling at his phone. New girlfriend? Hartwell asked. No, Porter said. Hartwell looked skeptical. Porter put his phone down. In April, Emmett got sick. It wasn't serious, an ear infection that became a fever that became 3 days where Joanna was working from her kitchen table, with a 4-year-old asleep on the couch behind her. She mentioned it in passing, the way she mentioned most personal things, briefly, without expectation of anything. Porter sent soup. He didn't know why he did it. It wasn't the kind of thing he did. He'd never sent anyone soup. His assistant Bridget actually repeated the request back to him to confirm she'd heard correctly. But he called a restaurant near Leslieville and had it delivered. Chicken and rice, something mild, and a small container of the blueberry muffins because he remembered. She texted him that evening. Emmett wants to know how you knew about the muffins. He smiled at his phone for an embarrassingly long time. Lucky guess, he texted back. He says thank you. I say thank you. The soup was perfect. He put the phone down, picked it up again. Put it down. How's the fever, he typed. Coming down. He's watching something about pterodactyls and eating half a muffin. Good. Porter, yeah, why did you send soup? He sat with that for a moment. The honest answer was something he wasn't sure he was ready to say. He typed because I thought you could use it. A long pause. Then I could, thank you. He stared at the conversation on his screen. The city was loud outside his windows, the lake dark beyond the lights, and he was sitting in his expensive apartment feeling something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Like something was opening up that he'd thought was permanently closed. He didn't sleep well that night. But for the first time in months, it wasn't because of the quiet. The call came on a Wednesday morning at 7:40. He was already at his desk when his phone lit up with a number he didn't recognize, and some instinct he couldn't account for made him answer it instead of letting it go to voicemail. Mr. Wyndham? A woman's voice, clinical and careful. This is the admitting desk at St. Michael's Hospital. We have a Joanna Vick here. She's listed you as her emergency contact. Everything in him went very still. What happened? She was brought in about 40 minutes ago. She's stable. She was in a minor collision on the DVP. She has a concussion and a fractured wrist, and she's asking for her son. We're trying to locate family. I know where her son is, Porter said, already standing, already reaching for his coat. He knew because she'd mentioned it once. Emmett was at a daycare on Carlaw, a small place called Morning Star. The woman who ran it was named Patricia, and Joanna paid a little extra for the late option because her hours were unpredictable. He knew this because he listened when she talked. I'll handle it. I'm on my way. He was at St. Michael's in 18 minutes. He texted his assistant from the lobby. Clear my morning. Clear my afternoon. I'll explain later. He found Joanna in a curtained bay in the emergency department, her left wrist in a temporary splint, her hair loose, a small cut at her temple that had been cleaned and steri-stripped. She was sitting upright and she looked. He would remember this later. Not frightened exactly, but the kind of exhausted that comes after fear has passed. Like someone who had been running hard and stopped. She looked at him. Something in her face shifted in a way she quickly controlled. You didn't have to come, she said. Emmett's at Morning Star with Patricia. He's fine. I've already called ahead. He's going to stay for lunch and I'll pick him up unless you tell me someone else should. She stared at him. How do you know about Patricia? You mentioned her in March. He pulled the chair closer to her bay and sat down. You were telling me about a story you were filing late, and you said Patricia was good about the late option. Joanna looked at him for a long moment. The monitor beside her beeped quietly. Somewhere behind the curtain, a nurse was talking to someone in a low, reassuring voice. I listed you as my emergency contact 8 weeks ago, she said finally. When I updated my records after, there was a form, and I put you down, and I thought it was probably strange, but you felt like the person I'd want to call. Porter didn't say anything. He wasn't sure there was anything to say that wouldn't come out wrong, that wouldn't be either too much or too little. She started. I'm glad you did, he said. She looked away. Her jaw was tight in the way of someone keeping something back. I hate this, she said quietly. I hate being the person who needs the help. It's been a long time since someone just showed up. I know, he said. And then, because it was true and because it was the only thing that seemed worth saying, I'm not going anywhere. She didn't answer right away. Outside the curtain, the hospital moved around them. Voices, wheels on linoleum, the distant sound of someone's name being called over an intercom. Porter sat with the sound of it and didn't move. The muffins, she said suddenly. He looked at her. That's when I knew, she said. When you sent the muffins. Because I hadn't told you about them. And you had been listening the whole time. She swallowed. Nobody listens like that. He thought about the note under the wiper blade. Your left rear tire is going flat. The small, precise act of paying attention to something that didn't require it. You do, he said. She looked at him again, and this time she didn't look away. He picked up Emmett from Morning Star at 3:15. The boy regarded Porter with the frank suspicion of a 4-year-old meeting an adult in an unexpected context. He was small and dark-haired, and he was holding the rabbit, Gerald, in one hand and a drawing in the other. Are you my mom's friend? Emmett asked. I am, Porter said. Emmett looked at him carefully. Do you like pterodactyls? I don't know much about them, Porter said honestly, but I'd like to learn. Emmett appeared to find this acceptable. He held up the drawing, something in purple crayon that might have been a dinosaur or a very ambitious cloud, and said, That's a Quetzalcoatlus. It had a wingspan of 11 meters. That's enormous, Porter said. The biggest flying animal that ever lived, Emmett said, with the authority of someone stating a known fact, and climbed into the back seat. Porter drove them to St. Michael's. Emmett fell asleep in the car seat somewhere on Parliament Street. Gerald held loosely against his chest, and Porter drove the rest of the way in a quiet that felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like peace rather than absence. He sat in the hospital parking lot for a few minutes after he turned off the engine. Emmett's breathing was slow and even in the back seat. The afternoon light was the particular pale gold of a Toronto spring, filtered and hesitant, and the city outside was ordinary and loud. He thought about his condo on King West, about the boxes that were still in the second bedroom, about the birthday cake in the boardroom, and the drink he hadn't finished, and the windows and the dark lake, and every night for the past year and a half that he had been so profoundly, quietly alone. He thought about a woman in a green coat crouching on a sidewalk, promising polka dots to a small boy who was at the end of his resources. He thought about the note under his wiper blade. He hadn't known that morning in the parkade that it was the beginning of anything. He'd just thought it was a strange, kind gesture from a stranger. He'd thought he'd keep it for a day and then forget it. He still had it. He kept it in the breast pocket of his jacket, moved it when he changed jackets, moved it again. He didn't examine this too closely, the way you don't examine something that's become necessary. You just keep it. Emmett stirred in the back seat, made a small sound, settled again. Porter got out of the car. They didn't say everything that evening. You never do, Porter understood later. The things that matter most are never said all at once. They're said in layers, over time, and sometimes they're not said at all but shown, which is the more reliable form anyway. What happened was, Emmett woke up in the parking lot, cranky and disoriented, and Porter carried him inside, because he was still half asleep and Gerald had slipped under the seat. And when they got to Joanna's bay, she was sitting up straighter, and her eyes were brighter. And when she saw her son, she reached out, and Emmett went to her with the complete confidence of a child who has never had to doubt his welcome. And then he looked at Porter over Emmett's shoulder and said, This is Mom's friend. He knows about pterodactyls. Joanna looked at Porter. Porter looked at Joanna. Not really, he said. I'm being educated. She smiled. It was different from the other smiles he'd seen from her. Not the professional one, not the wry one, not the slightly guarded one she used when something surprised her. It was the kind of smile that appears when someone lets down a weight they've been carrying so long they'd stopped noticing. Emmett, she said. This is Porter. She stopped, glanced at Porter. A friend, he said. She held his gaze for a second. A very good one, she said quietly. She published the Portland's piece in May. It was thorough and fair, and it included significant amounts of information she'd gotten from him on background, attributed to sources close to the project in the way of careful journalism, and when his COO Hartwell read it and said it was the least hostile piece on a Wyndham project the Examiner had run in years, Porter said only, She's good at her job. He didn't mention the rest of it. There was a version of his life, the public version, where Porter Wyndham was a CEO with a recent divorce who was focused on the company. He was not yet sure how to introduce another version. He wasn't sure Joanna was either. What they were, that spring, was careful. They were two people who had both spent time alone and knew the particular costs of getting it wrong. And they were moving at the pace of people who understood that some things are worth not rushing. He met her for lunch on a Wednesday, just the two of them, at a small Italian place near her office, and they talked about the city and about the paper and about Emmett's increasingly sophisticated dinosaur taxonomy, and at the end of it she said, This isn't really a lunch about the Portland's follow-up, is it? No, he said. I didn't think so. She looked at her coffee. Porter, yeah, I don't need someone to fix things, she said. I want to be clear about that. I've been doing fine. I know change a tire and manage a sick kid and file a story and pay my bills. I'm not looking for someone to come in and solve my life. I know, he said. That's not what this is. Then what is it? He thought about it. I think it's someone who wants to be in the room, he said. Not to fix anything. Just to be there. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the restaurant, a streetcar went by, the particular grinding clang of it, very Toronto, very ordinary. I kept your number in my phone under Portland's, she said. For 6 weeks. He looked at her. What did you change it to? The corner of her mouth moved. Porter, she said simply. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that while the restaurant moved around them, and he thought, there it is, the thing he had been standing at the window looking for that he hadn't known to name. He told Hartwell in June. He told him the whole thing, more or less, the parking lot, the tire, the note, the soup, the hospital. Hartwell listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Hartwell. The journalist, Hartwell said. Yes, the one who wrote the Portland's piece. Yes. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. She's going to keep writing about the company. I know. That's not going to be uncomplicated. I know. Are you happy? Hartwell said, which was also unusual for Hartwell, who was not generally a man who asked such things. Porter thought about this. He thought about a Tuesday morning in February, and a kid crying about a muffin, and a parking lot in the rain, and a note under a wiper blade, and a hospital room at 4 in the afternoon, and a boy telling him about a flying animal with an 11-meter wingspan. Yeah, he said. I am. Hartwell nodded. Then figure out the rest, he said, and went back to his spreadsheet. The boxes came out of the second bedroom on a Saturday in late June, a hot day, the CN Tower half haze in the humidity. Porter unpacked them himself, not because he needed what was in them, but because it seemed necessary. A way of stopping the pretense that he was still waiting to see how things turned out. He kept a photograph of his grandfather on the mantel, 2 trucks and a stretch of the Trans-Canada. He kept a note paper-clipped to a piece of cardboard now, in the breast pocket of a jacket he kept near the door. He'd stopped moving it from jacket to jacket. He'd just left it there. Your left rear tire is going flat. You might want to check before the highway. The woman in the green coat. He'd checked before the highway. He'd checked everything. On a Sunday morning in August, Porter Wyndham stood in the kitchen of a narrow Victorian semi in Leslieville while rain came down outside and something was cooking on the stovetop mocha pot, and Emmett was on the kitchen floor surrounded by drawings of prehistoric flying reptiles. And Joanna was reading the paper at the table, her left wrist in a brace she'd have off in 2 more weeks, her hair loose and her coffee going cold the way it always did. She looked up and caught him looking at her. What? She said. Nothing, he said. She looked at him for a moment with those eyes that had always been assessing whether he was useful or a complication. Then the corner of her mouth moved. Sit down, she said. Coffee's almost ready. He sat down. Outside the rain kept coming, steady, unremarkable. The kind of rain that doesn't ask you to notice it. Emmett looked up from the floor and said very seriously, a Quetzalcoatlus couldn't fly in rain like this. The air pressure would affect the wings. Is that right? Porter said. Probably, Emmett said, and went back to his drawing. Porter looked at Joanna. She had gone back to her paper, but she was smiling at it slightly, the way people smile at things they're pretending not to hear. He had spent a long time looking at a dark lake from a high window, waiting to feel like something was beginning. He understood now that it had been beginning the whole time, in parking lots and on wet sidewalks and in hospitals and on phone calls that went too long, in the small specific acts of someone paying attention. It begins the way most things begin. Not all at once. Just a note under a wiper blade. Just someone who noticed.